Hello, welcome to session 2 of the 6-part Synodality in Perspective series. This session is called Synodality and Medieval Reform. I am Il Kim, interim president of the American Exam Society. The society is co-organizing the series with the Nova Forum and the Lumen Christi Institute, two of its co-sponsors. The other co-sponsors are Commonweal, American Media, the St. Anselm Institute for Catholic Thought, and Collegium Institute. I encourage you to go to each of our websites to learn more about programs and activities. Each session comprises 2 speakers hosted by a moderator. This evening's moderator is Dr. Christopher Bellitto, who spoke at the first session. Dr. Bellito is professor of history at Kean University in New Jersey, where he teaches courses in ancient and medieval history. A specialist in the Middle Ages, church history, and reform, he is the author of 10 books and over 30 articles and book chapters published in the United States and Europe. He has twice won grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities. In summer 2019, he was a Fulbright specialist at the University of Canterbury in Christchurch, New Zealand, and in 2021-22, he was visiting scholar at Princeton Theological Seminary. Chris, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Il, and thanks to all of you for joining us for this second session. Well, this evening, we're going to be hearing from 2 speakers. I'm going to pose a question afterwards to get them started, and then we look forward to your questions, which I invite you to put in the chat. I will be synthesizing those questions if some of them overlap, and so please, as they come up, put them right there in the chat. Our 2 speakers this evening, Rick Serina and Margaret Reserve, and I have worked out that Rick, given what people are going to be talking about, Rick is going to go first, and then Margaret will come next. So our first speaker, joining us from St. Louis, is the Reverend Dr. Richard J. Serina, Jr., who is Executive Director for the Commission on Theology and Church Relations of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, and he teaches at Concordia Seminary in St. Louis. Rick wrote his dissertation on Nicholas of Cusa's Concepts of Ecclesiology and Reform, which Brill published in 2016 as Nicholas of Cusa's Brixen Sermons and Late Medieval Church Reform. He's edited books on Lutheran ecclesiology and Luther's debate at Leipzig in 1519, and has written numerous essays on ecclesiology and reform in the late Middle Ages and Reformation, including Irreparable Breach or Late Medieval Reform, Luther's Address to the Christian Nobility and the Conciliar Reform Tradition, which won the 2020 Douglas Murray Prize from the journal Renaissance and Reformation Review. So Rick, welcome. I invite you to share your screen and proceed.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Il, and special thanks to the Lumen Christi Institute for an opportunity to present today, and really for putting on this entire series. Now, I should probably begin with something of an admission. As a Protestant theologian and a Lutheran one at that, I'm sort of a fish out of water when it comes to these internal Roman Catholic discussions of synodality, collegiality, episcopalism, the like. Fortunately, this session is devoted to synodality in the Middle Ages, in particular, the relationship between synodality and medieval conciliarism. And there I'm a bit more comfortable due to my work on Nicholas of Cusa, the 15th century cardinal, and his intellectual and ecclesiastical contexts. Nicholas of Cusa was a participant at the controversial Council of Basel in the 1430s. It was there that he wrote what is still widely considered the most comprehensive treatise on conciliarism, 1434's De Concordantia Catholica, the Catholic Concordance. This monumental work was equally a Catholic ecclesiology, a defense of conciliar governance from canon law, and a proposed constitutional reform of the Holy Roman Empire. Drawing on the study of Cusa's thought and context, then, I want to focus my introductory comments on the ecclesiology behind conciliar theory. That conciliar ecclesiology has many points of overlap with the contemporary discussion of synodality, and I think it may help us just understand and talk about synodality in the present more clearly and more helpfully. I'm going to start, though, with an admittedly cursory overview of the conciliar movement itself. Most identify conciliarism with two 15th century councils: the Council of Constance, 1414 to 1418, and the Council of Basel, 1431 to 1449. These councils both tipped on intense debates concerning the relationship between Pope and Council. The impetus for the conciliar movement was the Western Schism of 1378 to 1417. After the 70-year residency of the Papacy in Avignon, rival popes emerged at Avignon and Rome from 1378 until 1409.
Rick, may I just interrupt for a moment? We can't see your screen if you're sharing the PowerPoint.
That would be a problem. Forgive me.
There we go. Thank you, Rick.
There we go. Perfect. My apologies. Oh, yeah. So forgive me. So after the 70 or so year residency of the Papacy in Avignon, rival popes emerged at Avignon and Rome from 1378 until 1409. Among the many ideas proposed to end the schism, the least volatile and more traditional was known as the Via Concilii, convoking a council to resolve the dispute. In 1409, the Council of Pisa attempted just this. It deposed both the Avignon and Rome popes and elected another. Yet when the other two popes did not relinquish their claims, the situation was only exacerbated because now there were three popes. Finally, in 1414, the Council of Constance met to resolve this and issued two pertinent decrees, Haec Sancta and Frequens. 1415's Haec Sancta declared the superiority of the council's decisions to those of the individual popes. On that basis, one of three rival popes, Gregory XII, abdicated his position, allowing the council to elect Martin V in his place. Constance also issued the decree Frequens in 1417, which stipulated the regular convocation of councils for the purpose of reform. After a short, relatively innocuous council met at Pavia and then Siena from 1423 to 1424, a new council opened in Basel in 1431. Basel proved exceedingly controversial and led to debates over who had the right to convoke, to preside over, and ultimately to transfer the council. And it was in this context that Nicholas of Cusa wrote his treatise on conciliar theory. Ultimately, the council would fracture in 1437 as a council minority composed of papal supporters, including a newly converted Nicholas of Cusa, transferred the proceedings to Ferrara and then to Florence for a reunion council with the Greeks. This council declared a short-lived union with the contingent from Constantinople in 1439 before concluding. The Rump Council at Basel elected its own rival, Antipope, and continued on at Basel and then Lausanne before dissolving in 1449. Most have come to identify the end of this conciliarist episode with the 1460 bull Execrabilis, which denied all future appeals to councils over popes. There's reason to doubt these brackets as sort of hard and fast, though, and I want to talk about some of that shortly. But with that as background, I want to turn now to the ecclesiological ideas behind conciliar theory. Well, it was once customary to think of conciliarism as a 15th century power struggle. Scholarship in recent decades has shown it to be a much more traditional ecclesiology that began earlier in the Middle Ages and continued well into the Reformation and beyond. The most important contribution to the origins of conciliar theory came from Brian Tierney, a specialist in medieval political thought. His Cambridge dissertation, published in 1955, traced conciliar ideas to two different precedents in canon law: the right to depose a pope and the concept of corporation theory. First, the deposition of a pope. The right to depose a contumacious pope was found in Gratian of Bologna's 12th century collection of canon law, the Decretum, and expounded on by its commentators. If a pope was in error and resistant to correction, canon law accorded the right to remove him, though it did not specifically authorize a council to do so. The other precedent was corporation theory, which was developed later by 13th century canon lawyers. Corporation theory held that elective communities were legal entities with agreed upon rules to govern them. This corporation theory emerged in the chartering of medieval universities, the regulation of local artisan guilds, social confraternities, but also in religious houses and cathedral chapters. Those two ideas gave late medieval jurists the raw materials necessary to construct a conciliar theory of governance. The council, as a rightly constituted governing body, represented the universal church and had the right to overrule, depose, and replace a pope if he persisted in error. But there was another development in Western ecclesiology that enabled conciliarists to see the church and its leadership in a more organic, interrelated sense. This came from the notion of the church as a mystical body. The mystical body metaphor for the church is found in the New Testament, where St. Paul describes the church as Christ's body, united to Christ as her head with diverse interdependent members. According to Henri de Lubac, Western theologians began to abandon more symbolic or mystical descriptions of the Eucharist in the 11th century. As a consequence, language regarding Christ's mystical body was now reserved exclusively for the church herself. The universal church was seen as a mystical body united together with Christ as its head. While Christ was the head of the church, conciliar thinkers also began to speak of the Pope as a secondary head, caput secundarium, where the head is split, as it was due to papal schism. The health or well-being of the church demands its unification. This is what led to the decisions at Pisa and Constance to take the emergency measure of deposing rival popes and replacing them with others. Conciliar theorists would push this a step further at Basel. They claimed that the council, rather than Pope or Curia, most closely represented the entire church as a mystical body, precisely because the council representatives were more proximate to the faithful than Pope or Curia. Of course, the mystical body was not simply a weapon against the papacy either. In his De Concordantia Catholica, for instance, Nicholas of Cusa argued that the empire was a mystical body too. The laws of the empire were the means through which it maintained its health, akin to blood coursing through the veins of the entire body. Later in his career, long after his turn to the papacy at Basel, Nicholas would write a reform proposal entitled Reformatio Generalis. There he argues that the Pope was the eyes of the mystical body. If these eyes were going to visit and reform the rest of the body, then they must be reformed first. The mystical body metaphor became something of an ideal, something to attain or work toward as a goal of reform. If the mystical body is capable of ill health, then reform is needed to restore that health. The council, as well as the Pope, were instruments in that reform. These three ideas all worked together in developing the ecclesiology of the conciliar movement. Medieval canon law provided the precedents, the stipulation that a contumacious pope could be removed, and the concept of corporation theory that endowed elective bodies with the right of representation. But it was the scriptural mystical body image that provided conciliar theory its distinctly theological basis. The council represented the mystical body as its agent of reform and was emboldened to reform the church when the papal head was incapable of doing so, as it was during the papal schism. So what became of these conciliar ideas? I'll leave the gory details rather for Professor Meserve's presentation, but briefly I'd say this. On the face of it, the Council of Constance was successful at applying at least a limited form of conciliar theory. It was able to rectify the papal schism, was able to reform curial abuses, and it was able to return some autonomy to the territorial churches. The notion that Haec Sancta established the permanent superiority of councils over the papacy did not last the 15th century, but it did help resolve the crisis of legitimacy facing the papacy at the time. The more controversial decree, Fraquin, stipulated the regular convocation of councils for the purpose of ongoing reform at intervals of 5 and 7, 10 years thereafter. That prescription obviously did not continue. But it should also be said that the reforms initiated by Constance, especially those aimed at curbing abuses in the Curia, did last decades. For instance, the limit of cardinals was maintained by multiple popes until Calixtus III in the 1450s, before later being obliterated by Renaissance popes such as Sixtus IV and Alexander VI. Even still, when Pius II sought to elevate several additional cardinals in 1460, he did so against the strenuous objections of Nicholas of Cusa, by then a cardinal himself. Nonetheless, if we understand the aims of the conciliar theory at Constance in a more sober, limited way, we can't help but say that they were at least marginally successful. Council of Basel is admittedly a little trickier. The composition of that council was far more diverse and volatile. It was broken down into committees based on topic rather than nations, as it had been at Constance. It also incorporated far more representatives of universities, religious orders, and secular authorities. Likewise, its arguments against the papacy went farther than Constance and created more division than it resolved, again, unlike Constance. It's been suggested that maybe this is why conciliarists like Nicholas of Cusa abandoned the conciliar cause for the side of the papacy. At least in Nicholas's case, he believed greater harmony was possible through the papacy than apart from it. Now, it's an open question whether conciliarism actually sought the thoroughgoing constitutional reform of church governance. Many at Basel, including the conciliarist version of Cusa, appear to think so. When conciliar representatives ran the risk of creating or increasing disunity, however, their lofty goal of restoring harmony and unity in the church, some sort of a homeostasis in the mystical body, was clearly not met. Synodality within a Catholic scheme, so far as I understand it, implies a delicate balance between Pope and Council, Curia and Bishop, head and members, the universal and the local. A doctrinaire shift in one direction or the other, no matter how well-intentioned it was at Basel, could not help but unsteady the ship. If a lesson is to be learned from the late medieval conciliar movement, the ecclesiology behind it, it may just be that this balance is delicate for a reason. It's more difficult to maintain than we might think. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick. We'll move directly to our next presentation, and I invite those of you who have some questions to put them in by clicking on the Q&A feature at the bottom as your questions come up, because we're going to be doing Q&A that way. I'll be reading the questions out and gathering some together. So our next speaker joins us from Notre Dame. It's a Midwest evening. Margaret Meserve is Glynn Family Honors Collegiate Professor of History and Director of the Glynn Family Honors Program at the University of Notre Dame. She is a scholar of the Italian Renaissance with a special interest in the history of the papacy. She is the author recently of Papal Bull. I wish I could write titles like that. Papal Bull, Print, Politics, and Propaganda in Renaissance Rome. And that's available from Johns Hopkins University Press from last year. The volume examines how the papacy adopted printing to broadcast news, information, propaganda, and disinformation in Rome in the first decades after Gutenberg. The book was, quote, highly commended for the DeLong Book History Prize by the Society for the History of Authorship, Reading, and Publishing. Meserve has published several other books, including a multi-volume translation of the autobiographical commentaries of the Renaissance Pope Pius II, and thank you for doing that because I've used those volumes. Dr. Meserve has won support for her work from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Council of Renowned Societies, and the Newberry Library in Chicago. She is also a fellow of the American Academy in Rome. So I join you. Thank you for joining us, Margaret, and I invite you to share your screen and take us to the next steps.
Can you see my screen? Yep.
Yes, I can, and we can hear you as well.
Okay, good. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. And I'm going to cover some of the same territory that Rick covered, but from more of a historical rather than a theological point of view. And I thought I would even go back a little further into medieval history to talk about some larger themes that I see in councils of both the sort of central as well as the late Middle Ages. And that might also give us some insight into the weaknesses of the institution or of the idea as well as the strength. So the council in the 15th century emerged, I think, as a way to address some rather worldly problems in the church, fiscal, bureaucratic, organizational, and as well as the larger question of exactly who was Pope and how they ought to be chosen. And I think that it also would fail for largely worldly reasons, as you've already heard to some degree, but I'll go over some of those in more detail. So just to review, ecumenical or universal councils in the Middle Ages were not truly ecumenical as they'd been in the earlier medieval period because they no longer included the Greek Church. But even so, after the split with the Greek Church in the 11th century, the Latin Church convened 7 times, about once every 30 to 40 years, to address particular problems or issues that had arisen in the church. These kind of central ecumenical councils of the Middle Ages were almost always convened by the Pope. You see that 4 times they met at the Lateran, the episcopal see of the Bishop of Rome. And the membership tended to be the Pope, cardinals, senior churchmen from across Europe. And they were convened to address a series or a variety of problems. Some were pastoral or doctrinal. For example, questions about clerical celibacy, simony, the Eucharist, new orders emerging in the church. Sometimes the issues were baldly political, disputes between Pope and Emperor over the appointment of bishops. The deposition of the Emperor Frederick II was the famous accomplishment of the First Council of Lyon, the dissolution of the Templar Order, and so forth. And rather more often than you might think, councils address the question of how to elect a pope. And so you see here just a few of those activities, deposing an anti-pope during the schism of the 12th century, and refining the procedure for electing a pope and eventually really vesting it in the College of Cardinals and describing how those elections ought to take place. All of those things were essentially agreed upon or decreed or legislated by councils. And here, I'll go all the way back towards the very beginning to remind you that in the early church, there really was no standard procedure for how to make a pope. Anyone from the emperor to the Roman people, to the emperor in Constantinople or the emperor of the Frankish kingdom could and did at certain points set a candidate on the throne as the Bishop of Rome. Over the medieval period, this procedure was refined, often by councils, as we've said, so that by the 13th century, the idea was that it was the cardinals who were vested with the authority of electing a pope, and that they should do so in conclave. And this resolution seemed to be the safest and the most efficient and the most foolproof way of electing a pope. Provided the cardinals themselves didn't let the process down. And of course, that's exactly what happened. So as you know, the papacy ended up in France or in French territory in Avignon for the better part of the 14th century. They had left Rome for various reasons. The city was not secure. And they were never really in captivity in Avignon, as people sometimes think. But they had strong political and economic and security reasons for remaining up there. In all, there were 7 Avignon popes over this time. All of them were French, and they mostly appointed French cardinals. There was always a sense that they should get themselves back to Rome. Everyone agreed that the Pope was the Bishop of Rome, and Rome had an important part to play in the conduct of the papal charism. But somehow there was never quite the devotion, in part because Rome by this point was something of a mess. It had been abandoned by the papal curia for 80 years. The Lateran Palace itself had experienced fire. We have kind of lamentations from the 14th century about how Rome had been left bereft. Rome was a widow bereft of her husband or her master and was sort of sinking into disrepair and so forth. Unfortunately, when a pope came along who did want to return to Rome, it went terribly. So Gregory XI took the papal court with him to Rome in 1377. And the city was entirely unprepared for the return of the papal curia. Not only was the papal palace in kind of smoldering ruins, there was nowhere for the cardinals themselves to live. There was no economy to kind of support the papal court. And then Gregory died 6 months later. The cardinals, and remember they were a majority of Frenchmen, thought they could persuade the new pope, Urban VI, to return to Avignon, but he refused. They had elected him in April, and by the time the long, hot Roman summer came to an end in 1378, a number of French cardinals decided that they had not understood the wishes of the Holy Spirit correctly at the previous conclave. They had elected the wrong man, and they promptly went and elected Clement VII, a French pope, in September. And Clement got on the road as fast as he could with the rest of the French cardinals back to Avignon, and the Great Schism was underway. So for 40 years, as you've heard, there were 2 popes in Europe. And it's worth really thinking what that meant for the average member of the faithful. There were 2 popes in Europe. That also meant that there were 2 colleges of cardinals, 2 curias, 2 chanceries, 2 treasuries, 2 hierarchies. And the chaos really spread out through all of Christendom, because depending on which obedience you were in, depending on which pope you recognized, you had to go to that papal establishment for the ordination of local bishops, for marriage dispensations, to secure indulgences or pardons, and for any number of other pieces of business. And there was always this certain amount of doubt about whether you were going to the right pope or not. Each pope was busily denouncing and excommunicating and declaring illegitimate the other. And there was a tremendous loss of confidence in the institution, and the prestige of the institution itself was greatly damaged. In 1409, as you've heard, the first council in nearly a century convened, really for the sole purpose, this is the Council of Pisa, of trying to adjudicate this dispute. It was not convened, as you might guess, by either pope, but really urged into being by the cardinals of the 2 rival obediences. And there was a little bit of selfishness there, not selfishness, but of course the cardinals knew that whichever pope or a new pope prevailed, they would probably remain as cardinals. So it was far less risky for them to convene a council to kind of find a new bishop of Rome than it was for the popes themselves. But as it happened, they only succeeded in electing a 3rd pope. And after another decade of confusion, the Holy Roman Emperor stepped in and tried again, sponsoring or lending his authority to this new Council of Constance. That was a vast gathering of cardinals and bishops and abbots and theologians from major universities. And they, of course, persuaded all 3 popes to resign. And a conclave made up not just of cardinals, but also of 30 members from the council itself, then elected a new pope, Martin V. And that was very important, that it was suddenly, for the first time in a very long time, elements beyond the College of Cardinals who were making this election. So with the election of Martin V, the council healed the schism in the church. But from Pope Martin's point of view, the relationship that had been kind of brought into being by that moment of election was highly problematic. It seemed that the council was now a body that could not just unmake popes or depose popes, but also make them as well. And the question was whether they could or should continue to have that power, and in a larger sense, just how much power they ought to have. The Council of Constance had, I guess I'll go with this slide, say this is a little bit of an anachronistic analogy, but there was a kind of potential that the council would emerge as something like an electoral body that would be regularly involved in the selection of popes. The Pisa, as you've seen, deposed 2 and elected 1. Constance had deposed 3 and elected 1. The Council of Basel, as you heard before, had also deposed Eugenius and elected an anti-pope, although theirs was never really recognized. In addition, as the price for getting Martin elected, Constance had issued a number of decrees which they demanded that Martin capitulate to as part of the price of his election. And again, we heard about these already, but just to kind of remind you of the very pointed language that sought to limit papal power in some ways. Here we have in Haec Sancta, this synod has its authority directly from Christ. Everyone, whatever their rank or dignity, even papal, is bound to obey what concerns the faith. And if anyone of whatever rank, including the Pope, refuses to obey, that person will be punished. That was fairly strong language. And the only way Martin could become Pope was essentially to acknowledge this. And what we see is as soon as he became Pope, he tried through various ways to limit how directly he had to respond to the strictures of these decrees. Second decree, Frequens, likewise was binding on the Pope, saying he must reconvene the council every 5 years, whether he wanted one or not. So that was the theory. Things began to get messy almost right away. Martin did convene a council in 1423, but he rushed through it as quickly as he could and declared it concluded, almost as soon as it had opened. And his successor Eugenius had no interest in convening the next council and procrastinated for over a decade. When Basel opened in 1431, it was here that Nicholas of Cusa was expressing his great idealistic hopes for what the spirit of a new council might do. But from Eugenius's point of view, the council was a dangerous attack on his authority, and he resisted almost everything the council asked for. And eventually he left, as we've heard, saying he was going down to Ferrara to consult with representatives from the Greek church. In Basel, the council fathers decided to depose Eugenius, just as they had deposed previous popes at Constance and at Pisa, and elected a new pope, Felix V. So once again, there were 2 popes in Europe, and even worse, 2 councils, all issuing decrees and proclamations against each other. Eugenius won this particular contest, but but he really won it by making concessions, both to the King of France and to the Holy Roman Emperor regarding essentially the question of local authority within the church, allowing the King of France to make more episcopal appointments and to keep more of the revenue from tithes and church tax within his own coffers rather than sending it to Rome. And he made similar capitulations to the Emperor Frederick III in order essentially to secure his backing against this anti-pope in Savoy. So where Martin had to kind of promise the council various things in order to secure his election, Eugenius had to promise the secular princes various things in order to secure their backing against the council as well. So technically, yes, after Basel, the conciliar movement had been hobbled. And again, with Pius's decree execrabilis, you see the language with which the popes were now repudiating the conciliar ideal. But they had won this victory at a tremendous price. By now, as we get, say, into the reign of Sixtus IV, The secular princes had got the idea that they could do more than just rescue a pope from a council. They could also threaten to launch a new council against a pope if they found he wasn't doing what they wanted him to do. So in the 1470s and the 1480s, Louis XI of France, Lorenzo de' Medici in Florence, and Frederick III, the Holy Roman Emperor, all threatened at various points to convene councils in order to humble or rein in Sixtus in the course of some very worldly diplomatic or military or financial dispute. And it's noteworthy, this is something I talk about in my book, that several of these characters even had pamphlets or decrees printed up and circulated in their domains that purported that these councils had already convened. So they were using all kinds of new technology and new media to sort of spread the word about that the Pope was about to be called to account in front of a new council. So this was sort of a public relations war now going on against the Pope. So by now, the council as an idea had really lost all of the theological and mystical idealism that Nicholas of Cusa had felt. It was becoming a tool of diplomatic negotiation and very little else. There was the idea of reforming the church seemed to have gone out the window. There was no question at this point of whether the church should be doing things like selling offices or indulgences or access to the sacraments. The question had really become who was going to get the greatest share of the profits from this, the secular prince, the local bishop, or the bishop in Rome. As we get into the 16th century, the French crown continued to be the major rival to the papacy and the major source of conciliar threats. And I'll just conclude with this last point. In 1510, Louis XII actually convened a council in Pisa, attended mostly by French cardinals, in which he threatened to depose Julius if he did not adopt a more friendly stance towards France. And this actually prompted Julius to convene a new council, the first papal council in almost a century. The council that we know as Lateran V. Julius had very little interest, in fact, in reforming the church. He called a council essentially to get the King of France off his back and to prove to the world that if there's going to be a council, it's going to be his, and it's going to happen in Rome. Lateran V was supposed to be a reform council. There was a lot of high-minded rhetoric at the start. John O'Malley, our recently departed friend, translated some stirring orations from the opening sessions of that council. But the proceedings were really mostly concerned with establishing and defending papal authority over the rival assembly at Pisa. When you read the decrees of Lateran V, it's a series of excommunications and bulls stripping cardinals of their offices and bulls forbidding attendance at Pisa and other kind of intramural disputes. Very little progress was made on the question of reform. And I think it's no coincidence that Lateran V concluded in the year 1517, the very year that Martin Luther decided to issue a much more direct call for reform within the church. So from 1417 to 1517, what do we see? There are many attempts to call councils as a means to heal division, to refine the theology and the administration of the church, to seek union with the Greeks, to defend Christianity against the Turks, to address doubts among the laity, to bring new voices into the church, and to renew the institution. These were all hopeful goals, which probably resonate with Catholics today. But it was also a conciliar movement that was all too subject to political pressures, impossible structural realities, and human frailty. So I don't mean to be too pessimistic here. The lessons of the Middle Ages are certainly sobering. The hierarchy was human, so is the larger body of the faithful, and secular concerns and personal or even selfish impulses can come into play anytime that authority comes to be transferred or shared or expanded. And I think these reflections may be useful to think about as this current process unfolds. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Margaret. So before I proceed, I just want to do a little housekeeping, and that is for those of you, and we have a nice robust crowd of over 140 participants, and thank you for being with us. There were some questions that came up as matters of fact a question that often comes up, Margaret, Rick, to myself. Do you mean John the 23rd? The answer is yes, we mean John the 23rd. And also some people ask for some recommendations on books on the papacy. So I recommended John O'Malley's. If you're wondering the difference to the participants, John O'Malley's is a bit more discursive and has John's standard storytelling quality. Eamon Duffy's book is more of a thunk of a book, more comprehensive if that's what you're looking for. To bring those up to speed who may not know, we are referring to the Jesuit church historian, although he called himself an historian of religious culture and the Renaissance. The Jesuit John O'Malley passed away at the age of 96 on Sunday and is having his funeral tomorrow down the block from Georgetown University, where he ended his career in Washington, D.C. Tomorrow. So before we get to 3 questions that are posted, and I invite others to add their questions, I'd like to pose to Margaret and Rick John O'Malley's favorite question, which was, so what? Who cares? And specifically, what happens in the next 100 years from Constance, or Margaret brought us right to the lip of 1517. We had in 2017 the 500th commemoration of the 95 Theses. So in other words, what I'm asking the two of you to reflect on is that these councils are essentially failures when it comes to reform. They have some limited success. They certainly unite the papacy, but they lead to other problems as well. So what's the importance of studying synods and councils in the 15th century for the 16th century, and if you'd like, for today? I think Margaret was going to go first on this one.
Okay, yeah. Well, I think yes, these things were not entirely successful, but if I can make an analogy to an entirely secular sort of process happening at the same time, we study the emergence of city-states in the Italian Renaissance. Even though by the year 1500, almost every one of them had been gobbled up by a monarchy or an imperial power. But it is interesting to us that at this moment in the 13th and the 14th century, something like republican or democratic self-government emerged in the Italian peninsula and was seen for the first time since antiquity. And I think in a very real way, this conciliar or synodal movement is the analog to that within the church, a sort of a democratizing is not quite the right word, but an attempt to expand the circle of authority and allow more voices in and more of a corporate approach to governance. And like the Italian city-states, this movement petered out in the face of vast political pressures. But it tells us something about the origins of our later institutions, both political and religious, sacred and secular. And I think they're important to study for that reason, that it was the emergence of a movement that didn't go away entirely. It went dormant for a long time and then it emerged again.
Thank you. Rick?
Yeah, I mean, I guess kind of my response would be twofold here. One is I do question the argument that the councils were unsuccessful. And it really depends on how you interpret them, right? I mean, I'll be the first to say I'm not a scholar. I'm a church bureaucrat, right? Who kind of plays scholar whenever I have free time. And looking at it ecclesiastically, again, if your assumption is that the councils intend a thoroughgoing constitutional reform of church governance, then in that sense they failed. Now, the reasons why they failed, again, we can posit any number of reasons, but in that sense, they failed. If, however, you think that they targeted specific issues and they had as their goal the remedying of these particular issues without any expectation that this would have any other dramatic transformation to the structure of the church, then I think they were successful in many respects. And I detailed some of them briefly, especially in my account of Constance. Again, Basel is there's some German literature on this that kind of talks about the way in which the arguments and issues at Basel evolved a little further than what were initially intended. That being said, I think that's the first thing I would say, is I would question, and this is I think, even from a historical perspective, why we need to return to it, because there's a broad spectrum of possibilities for how we interpret those councils, what the theology behind them, what the political theory behind them was, and what the expectation was in terms of what they were going to accomplish. But my second thing, though, and I'll say this not as a church bureaucrat, but as a Lutheran church bureaucrat who deals with Martin Luther and the Reformation a great deal, the conciliar episode is foundational, I think, for understanding some of the conflicts that occurred at the outset of the Reformation, right? You had specifically Luther's Dominican interlocutors, those who are Sylvester Prierius or Tommaso de Villacaitan, John Eck, who I don't think was Dominican, but they assumed that Luther was a conciliarist. In 1518, 1519, they could not look at his protest to certain questions of theology or church authority apart from the conciliar crisis, which to their minds was very fresh, because as Margaret detailed, the backdrop for the Fifth Lateran Council is the proposed council at Pisa and everything that issued from that. So I think it is impossible to understand the conflicts of authority in the early years of the Reformation apart from the background of this conciliar papalist controversy of the 15th century.
Thanks, Rick. Just to let folks know, we have about 25 minutes. We have 5 questions here, and you could certainly add some. So we'll ask for quick responses from our participants, and you can respond or not, have only one and not both, as you wish. And we're going to go in order. So the first comes in from Tom Isbicki, a friend of ours from the American Kusana Society, and he asks, how does synodality play out in the meetings with the Greek Church at the Second Council of Lyon, and then at the Ferrara-Florence Peace of Basel?
I'll jump in to say I don't know about the Second Council at Lyon at all, and I'm afraid to say. At Ferrara-Florence, the rhetoric of I think the emphasis was far much more on the universality of the church and the idea that it was, it was just wrong that there should be division in the church. This was the universal church, and this was an ecumenical council, and the requirement was to bring these peoples together. And so I think, to the extent that synodality was even really sort of invoked, in a sense, it was in service of this idea of unity. And of course, as we know, once the union was declared and the Greek prelates went back to Constantinople to announce it, they were met with absolute rejection by the people in Constantinople. They were utterly uninterested in the idea of union, and they just thought these people have gone to Florence and sold us out, or said something that we didn't authorize. Not in our name did you do this. And so they essentially repudiated it and said we'd rather Constantinople fall to the Turks than get into this arrangement. So I think in the diplomatic negotiations and in the rhetoric around the union, synodality was not much invoked. And then in practice, it turned out that, maybe they should have done some more consultation, because in the end, it was just not, it fell very, very flat.
I'm just going to move on. And so Tom Horvath, it's nice to see, by the way, so much church history and theology. Like justice and mercy, church history and theology should kiss more often. And Tom is raising this question, Tom Horvath. What was Aquinas' view of the relationship among council, synod, the mystical body, and the papacy?
Sure, I can. Let me again preface this by saying I'm in no way a Aquinas scholar, and nor do I want to kind of venture to answer that express question. But what I will say is that there continue to be debates about this within the Dominican tradition, and there's a lot of scholarship now, specifically Ulrich Horst and his student Thomas Prugel addressing this, just how Aquinas viewed the authority of the papacy, just how he viewed the relationship between the papacy and the church, and the role the council played in that. But that really ends up being played out more in internal Dominican discussion, more so than sort of scholarship on Aquinas himself. The other thing I would add to that, though, is it's also kind of hazardous, and I think this is to some degree I used Anna de Lubac in this discussion because he's sort of pivotal for how we talk about this. But I still have my reservations about his thesis more generally, and one is that you just did not have robust discussions of the church qua church at that stage, right? You really don't have that emerging until the 14th century. And really, once you get past these tensions over the relationship between papacy and empire, once you get past that in the 14th century, that's when the church as church really becomes a substantial discussion, and the literature begins to emerge out of that. But generally speaking, Aquinas is not addressing that specifically or comprehensively in any way, shape, or form, as nobody in the 13th century and 12th century are. Right?
I would just add, if I can, as a late medieval church historian, that my own feeling is that the discussion of the church as the mystical body of Christ on the Catholic side is lost in the debates on transubstantiation, consubstantiation, the real and abiding presence. And whereas I think in the 11th and 12th century, to the degree people were talking about what is the church, there are in ecclesiological tracts, I think they mean the people of God as the mystical body of Christ, which gets lost because those only become discussions of Eucharist and then is recaptured, I think, along with the notion of the church as a pilgrim in Vatican II. Beryl Biles takes us into some hardcore politics. How did popes and Holy Roman Emperors clarify their roles? I think, Margaret, we're going to ask you to turn to that one.
Okay. In the broadest possible terms, in the late Middle Ages, it was understood that the Pope was the head of the church and responsible for the souls and the salvation of all Christians who were obedient to the Latin church, and that the emperor was the supreme temporal authority in Europe, responsible for the defense of the faith, the political order. The problem was that those two spheres were so incredibly intertwined in this period. And just to give you some examples, there could be in any one city, there could be a cathedral that had rights extended to it by the papacy going back several centuries, that was built on land that was, legally subject to the Holy Roman Emperor. And when it came time to appoint a new bishop, but not just a new bishop, or a new canon to the cathedral chapter, or to decide what was going to happen to the rents that were being paid to the treasury of that cathedral, or who was going to pay for the repair of that cathedral. There were all kinds of overlapping jurisdictions where Pope or Emperor could suddenly step in and say, that's a question that belongs to me, or that's not my problem, that's for the other guy. And so this goes all the way back to the 12th century or the 11th century, where Pope and Emperor began to argue about who was going to appoint bishops in the lands outside of Rome. But by the time you get to the 15th century, it's just, the entire world has become more complex, legally, financially, and bureaucratically, and there's just endless kind of competition over these things. And when you then sort of step back again, ultimately, the two sides were sort of still in the same stalemate they'd always been in terms of, each had a great deal of authority in Europe, but all of these little conflicts could be used as sort of levers or leverage against one another in one dispute or another. And so there was a lot of conflict. And of course, when you get to Luther and the question of, is this dissident theologian going to be handed over to Rome for kind of interrogation and possible discipline? And, ultimately the emperor sort of says, no, I think he's a citizen of my jurisdiction. And I think he can stay right where he is. So there's a lot of there's a lot of overlap and therefore a lot of conflict.
And it is the unresolved question of ultimate loyalty that Becket makes one decision on, that others would make a different decision, is that you have religious authority with political overtones and political authority with religious overtones. The longest lived form of government on the planet is theocracy, and none of going back to Pharaoh. Right? Thomas Coover asks, what impact does the Leonine privilege have in the midst of all these councils? I am not sure I know. Perhaps, do either of you know specifically what Thomas might be talking about?
So I believe this is, there is in the Central Middle Ages, a certain number of dioceses are granted a certain amount of autonomy by the papacy. Again, probably as concession for certain arrangements or agreements, and it's somewhat codified under Leo X in 1520. So there's a kind of theory that certain dioceses, or perhaps by extension all of them, were given a certain amount of self-rule or self-autonomy over against the central church. I think but I don't know much about it. And my guess is the key is in the name, because it's a privilege that's really codified by Leo in 1520. It doesn't have much to do with our period. Or it's not a live issue in the years before 1520.
So moving for a moment to modernity, Pat Cormack asks, the current flap over the German synodal process seems to have some parallels to the messiness of the conciliar track. Is this fair or naive? I'm willing to answer that one.
Yeah, good.
So for those of, I believe that Pat is referring to the fact that the bishops in Germany today, so we're now in the midst of a 3-year process of the Synod on Synodality, which is the inspiration for this six volume, if you will, series, 6 installment series, where people at the diocesan level are asking questions and offering answers, and it's moving up to the national and regional level. That's where we are now, culminating in October 2023. The German group of bishops has kind of jumped the gun a little bit and is asking kind of larger questions and saying, well, maybe we should be talking about women deacons. Maybe we should be talking about women's ordination. And that has caused some people to think that they are overstepping their boundaries. And so my response, without getting into the weeds of what the German bishops are doing now or what they intend, my own feeling is that what they intend to do is push the envelope. Is that yes, and that Pope Francis fully embraces this messiness. He refers to the church as a field hospital, and that he thinks it's by putting everything together that the good ideas will emerge and the bad ideas will sink to the bottom. Councils and synods, especially in the 15th century, are messy places. So let me pose this question. Let's see if Rick was going to be interested in answering this, or perhaps Margaret. Christina, and I'm going to mispronounce your last name, Prestfilippo. Is there any evidence that the bishops and popes were at all concerned about the everyday faith evangelization of the laity? This does seem like it's high politics.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Please, Margaret.
Go ahead.
Rick, please.
I would say it all depends on which bishop and which pope, right? And I can at least speak again for Nicholas of Cusa here, because I'm very familiar with that. And categorically, yes. Whether it was he was a residential bishop for roughly 6 years, preached on a pretty much a twice a month basis. He instituted all sorts of reforms that were aimed at popular devotion. One of the criticisms of him is that he was in fact overbearing in his approach to reform because of how seriously he took it. He even wrote theologically about the laity and some of his more speculative treatises. So I think again, categorically in his case, yes, a reform meant, and again, this goes back to the mystical body image, that there's a lot of polyvalence to that head and members relationship, right? I mean, it can refer to Pope and Cardinal. It can refer to to Bishop and the laity in the parish, right? The members can apply to any number of groups, and I think for him that was if the head is to be reformed from Pope down through diocesan bishop, then that would have a correlative effect upon the lives of the laity in that congregation and in that diocese. So categorically in his case, but again, I also understand, and Margaret has pointed this out to me, that Nicholas Occlusive maybe is not the most representative bishop of the period.
I would add that I think you could almost, if you could chart it, there's a kind of medieval high, and then there's another kind of high with the Council of Trent. And our period is a little bit of a valley between them. But some of those earlier councils that I mentioned of the Central Middle Ages, there were some important steps taken, very much with the laity in mind. So the requirement for annual confession and annual Eucharist was a real revolution in the life of the church. They were saying this is not something that's just for monks and nuns or priests. We want the laity to participate in this sacrament at least once a year. And that was absolutely revolutionary for 1215. There were also decrees requiring cathedrals to have schools for the poor children or children of the poor laity. And at one of the councils, there was a great emphasis on the teaching of languages so that the church could go out and do mission work. And when you jump ahead to Trent, you see this, really remarkable Counter-Reformation concern with catechesis and instruction. And there's all kinds of information about what the laity should be reading and how they should be taught and how they should be invited into the Mass and the other sacraments. So with that framework, our 15th century is kind of a dismal period because there really are squabbling more about political and kind of hierarchical issues. But even there, some of the things they were trying to reform, for example, absenteeism was one of the big abuses within the church. This is where, and pluralism. So this is where one person can get themselves appointed bishop of 3 or 4 different cities. And then they would collect all the income from those bishoprics, and they would sit in a palace in Rome and participate in ecclesiastical politics at the Roman court. But in the meantime, no one was looking after the faithful. And this was actually one of the things that the sort of imperial or conciliar side really wanted the church to address. They said, you need to send us bishops, and those bishops need to be here in the city looking after our people. And there was a lot of reasons why the papacy didn't want to really give in on that. And there were a lot of reasons why they suspected why the emperor wanted a local bishop. So it never really got resolved. But so even in this 15th century, the question of how the faithful were being cared for was always at the bottom of these issues, even if it was not always clear.
Thank you, Margaret. So in the 10 minutes that we have left, we have 3 questions. The first one from an anonymous attendee. 2 simple questions for the speakers. This, by the way, came up last week. What is the difference between conciliarism and synodality? What is the relation between conciliar theory and synodality? Rick, you want to take that one?
Sure. And again, I'm going to hazard a definition in a Roman Catholic view of synodality, and please correct me if this is inaccurate. As I understand it from the discussions in Vatican II and subsequently, it is the notion that sort of the local diocese with the bishop celebrating the Eucharist. This is sort of the principal unit of the church. And that then the aggregate of those is then the universal church gathering together in synod. So it's again similar to, I guess, maybe your discussion in Roman Catholicism with regard to kind of the local and universal. Conciliarism is entirely different. It is a theology of decision making in the church. Right, how you make decisions, which is very different from what the church kind of is and how the church gathers. And again, if I'm presenting synodality accurately in that respect, conciliar theory, and in this sense, conciliar theory has a much longer a lifespan, maybe even in Protestantism. than Roman Catholicism after the Reformation, especially amongst Anglicans. Right, they are probably the most committed to this notion of conciliar decision making in the church through council and conference. So yeah, I would say that is the fundamental difference. One is sort of more strictly an ecclesiology, and the other is a theory of decision making in the church.
And I would only add, and then I have a question that I'm going to give to the next question to Margaret. I would only add that it's the October 2023 Synod on Synodality is not a general council. There have only been 21 general councils, not all of them ecumenical, strictly speaking, in the life of the church. And it's a little difficult when you're doing your homework, because early in the church and even in the medieval period, the words are sometimes used imprecisely. And so it's a little bit easier to say synods seem to be local and regional, and then they lead to bigger councils. It's not quite that. I'm sure Margaret is screaming right now with my statement like that, but it's not, the sources are not clear all the time. You have to kind of infer. So maybe you could correct that, Margaret, but also the next question I'm going to give to you from Luis Carlos Ayala. With kings and emperors influencing councils, in your own examples, Louis XI, Lorenzo de' Medici, Frederick III, did church leaders fear the printed press, your new book, influencing the laity to leave the church due to its corruption and lack of holiness? And Luis puts the words "leave" and "holiness" in quotation marks.
Great. I'll say, well, the one thing about synod, just maybe to even reassure people's minds, ultimately they're just, one word is from Greek and one is from Latin. And they sort of describe the same thing, but we just have these sort of two different, so if you think about it, the syn prefix in Greek and con in Latin both mean with. And they just describe a coming together of people, or a kind of, process of consultation. And so you'll see that haec sancta, which is the great bull or decree of the Council of Constance. We define, or we identify decrees by their opening words. The third word is synodus, right? It's haec sancta synodus, this holy gathering. And they're using synod to describe their council. So yeah, I think that's very interchangeable, and not to worry too much about that. This is a really interesting question about, was anyone worried about people leaving the church? And I think a very simplistic answer would be to say in 1475, there was nowhere really for the laity to go. When you say leave the church, when we talk about it in the 16th century, leaving the church, it means you leave for Protestantism, or you convert to this, a different form, which in your mind is still the true form of Christianity. 75 years earlier, in 1400, there were other places to go. So in the late Middle Ages, there were a lot of heretical movements that had picked up a lot of steam. The Hussites, the Wycliffites, the Lollards, and so forth. And so there was always a little danger that, sure, the laity might get fed up of what's going on and go off into some kind of heretical sect. But there was not another institutional church that you could join in this period. So it's almost too, I could give you a really, really long answer about the ways in which the popes and the local secular princes worried about the affections and the allegiance of their subjects. But they worried about kind of where their contributions might go, or where their political support might go, but they didn't really worry about people actually renouncing their identity as Catholics to go somewhere else.
Which leads us to our last question, which is right into that. Was the fate of Jan Hus at Constance, for those of you who don't know, Jan Hus is declared a heretic at Constance and is burned to death, even though the Holy Roman Emperor had given him a safe passage. Was the fate of Jan Hus at Constance peripheral to the conciliar issue, or was it a forecast of how the Roman Church and the Emperor will deal with dissent?
Yeah, I'd be pleased to. And maybe I'm just a really bad Lutheran, because from the perspective of Luther and the Reformation, the latter is true. But to be quite frank with you, there's very interesting literature, specifically by Thomas Fudge, on the legitimacy of Huss's heresy and his trial and his ultimate execution. That legally speaking, this was an enactment of laws that were really on the books, and that in many respects Huss misunderstood things such as the promise of safe passage and what that actually entailed. So I wouldn't read too much into that, because again, at Constance you still have as I would suggest, a more successful version of conciliarism at work, without some of the and it's not to say that it's not involved with with political power, or the use of force, but still a highly optimistic view of the councils and what the councils could accomplish. And I don't think they would sort of stake their reputation and their reform of the church on that issue. But then again, I guess the case could be made that this is an attempt to show that we are not headed towards some sort of a libertinism or whatever may have been alleged against them. So I see both sides. I tend to approach it as in a legal context, and I do think that that there were merits, as sort of odious as that may be to the 21st century eyes.
Thank you. So please join me in thanking our presenters, Margaret Meserve and Rick Serina. Please do type their words into Google and buy their books. I want to reiterate a few things that came up in the chat that folks may not have seen. Some people were asking if they could see the PowerPoints. These sessions will be posted on the Lumen Christi website, and you will be able to move through that and freeze the screen, and get the information down. So we won't be posting the PowerPoints, but you will have access to them. And I think they'll go up in a day or two. That will include the ones from last week that you may have missed, and the future ones as well, if you missed them, but we do hope that you will join us live for those. The second is that a number of people in the chat asked to reiterate the two books that, and again, this is not Lumen Christi or Rick or Margaret, this is Chris Bellito recommending the two books on the papacy. One by John O'Malley, A History of the Popes from Peter to the Present. O'Malley, A History of the Popes from Peter to the Present. That was put out by Rowman and Littlefield, R-O-W-M-A-N and Littlefield. And the second is Eamon Duffy's Saints and Sinners, and I think that that's in the 4th edition, and that is Yale University Press. So I want to thank specifically Dan Stanley of Lumen Christi Institute, who even joined us beforehand. You put 3 medievalists and Zoom together, and something is not going to go right, and Dan made everything go right. So I'm very thankful not only to Rick and Margaret for a terrific conversation, but to the great skill of Dan in helping us. We're also grateful to our sponsors, the Lumen Christi Institute, the Nova Forum at USC, and the American Hosanna Society for co-organizing this series, and our co-sponsors, America Media, Commonweal, the Collegium Institute, and the St. Anselm Institute for Catholic Thought. So our next installment is going to be on Monday, Synodality and the Roots of Vatican II, and that's Monday, September 19th, featuring Sean Blanchard and Kristen Kohlberg. The person sitting in my chair as moderator is Kathy Sprouse-Cummings, and you can register today at the link posted in the chat. So that will be on Monday, September 19th at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. So you can find out more and support this series at lumenchristi.org. I thank you all for being with us. I want to say that I'm humbled to be sitting in the same line with Rick and Margaret, whose work I've used, and I would invite you to explore their work more. You'll learn a lot. Thanks very much, everyone, for joining us, and please do join us next time. Thank you.